All right, it's good to see you today, and we're going to highlight some of the lesson for next week on November the 3rd. The lesson for November 10th is done as well, and we'll be getting that out to you soon. It'll be on Sunday School Central by tomorrow, and then we'll get them printed and out to you. But for next week, please take some time to talk about at the beginning of class about Neighbor Day and our concepts of identifying and have those people that they've identified in their neighborhood added to the prayer list in your class. And then, of course, we're going to be talking about the following week, investing in those people, trying to do some random acts of kindness to your neighbors, trying to establish a better relationship and a chance for you then to invite them to be part of Neighbor Day, all right? The lesson for next week is taken from the first 14 verses of chapter 5 in Ephesians. Again, we're talking about the real practical application now of a lot of the doctrine we've learned earlier in Ephesians 1 through 4. 1 through 3 really, and 4 and 5 and 6 are really the practical application parts. Our objective statement next week is believers can live out Christ-likeness by embracing these three practices. And it's just the real simple thoughts of imitation, isolation, and illumination. I'll explain specifically the isolation idea shortly. It's not the idea that we live sequestered and isolated from the world, but the fact that we do isolate ourselves from the worldly actions that predated people's salvations. Related to Ephesus, the people of the Roman world, they believed in a whole bunch of gods, and they never knew exactly how to appease the gods. Every culture in the world that has multiplicity of gods, they're always in tension, because if you try to serve this god, then maybe you've offended these three others. And so you try to appease them, and maybe you've done something wrong towards this God. It's a very pessimistic way of living, and of course we understand that. But in Ephesus, that's the culture they lived in. In fact, the Romans actually believed at times gods came to earth in physical form. And you remember even in the scriptures, the book of Acts, you'll remember when Paul and Barnabas were at Lystra, they actually, after doing some miraculous works, they actually started calling them. Barnabas, they called Zeus, and Paul, they said, was Hermes, the son of Zeus, and the spokesman for the group. But and they quickly had to say, no, But that just underscores how these pagan people believed in those kinds of things. But within that culture of Ephesus, there was this, the cult that we've talked about oftentimes, and it was just an ungodly, immoral thing that they did. So as Paul gets into the lesson, he's going to refer back to some of those kinds of actions here in Ephesians chapter 5. And what he's going to encourage believers to do is to imitate God. And that's really a big takeaway from this lesson. Okay? And so the first point in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 5 is imitation. And the idea is this. It says, be ye therefore, and it ties us again back to chapter 4, the last couple verses. You'll remember chapter 30, verse 31 we looked at today, talked about all of these sins that they had lived like as unbelievers. But then in verse 32, it says, but be ye kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. So when Paul says, but ye therefore, because of the way you have been changed, this is the way you are supposed to walk. And he goes on into identifying the fact that because of God's grace and forgiveness, we are to be followers of God as dear children, which is a beautiful illustration there of our relationship to the Father. In other words, we are to imitate God. And I suggested take some time in your class maybe to entertain an anecdote or two about how sometimes we see our kids actually imitating us. You know, some some memory circumstance where a child was mimicking everything you were doing, every movement you made. That is how children are towards a loving father. And we are to imitate God in this point. All right. And the reason why we are to walk the way God walks and imitate Him is because, first of all, He loved. We're supposed to love like God. We are to recognize that Christ loved us so much that He sacrificially gave His life. That's all part of verse 2 there. And so He hath given Himself for us. That means we are to also love sacrificially. And His offering, sacrifice to God was right, good, acceptable to God. It was a sweet-smelling savor, right? So our worship to God, our imitation of God, it should be acceptable. It should be good and acceptable, just like Jesus' sacrifice was. So this idea then of isolation, point 2, is that, again, he introduces or reintroduces the fact that in that culture there were examples of fornication, all uncleanness, and for the believer who's imitating Jesus, we must completely isolate ourselves from those kinds of sexual sins. And I underscored this on the top of page 3. Far from the self-sacrifice model through the death of Jesus, sexual immorality is the epitome of self-indulgence. It's just the opposite of the imitation we should be following with Jesus. And so Paul ties, in verse 3, for example, fornication and uncleanness to the sin of covetousness. What do you make of that? How would you describe the connection between sexual immorality and covetousness?
Covetousness is desiring something that you are not entitled to.
Okay.
And so to be sexually immoral, you are desiring something that is not yours. The only allowable, lawful sexual union is a man and wife in marriage.
Right.
So to desire anything else that is to covet it.
Good. Yeah, and both when we talk about greed, covetousness, and immorality, really the root sin in all of that is pride and selfishness. And so that's going to be another part of this. But Paul goes on to say we should not let such sins be named one time among us if we are true saints. And so that's an important part of what he's saying in this isolation idea. Don't go back to that terrible paganism that existed before you were saved and or is still all around you all the time. So he's encouraging people not to practice any of those things. Now again, we underscored in this lesson, but the idea that none of us are sinless, we'll still have sin. But for those who habitually practice such things, it very likely could speak to the fact they never were saved. If some of these believers at Ephesus were going back to that immoral, ungodly lifestyle that existed around them in their pagan worship, it's a real strong indication that they probably never were true converts. And so the best practice for our life is to avoid any such contact with that kind of thing. Not avoid contact with people who need Jesus, but avoid contact with actions that we know are ungodly and immoral. And so Paul's saying, don't let any man deceive you in this way. Their vain words were just deceptions, trying to entice gullible people to go back into the way they were. And he specifically says in that passage that the wrath of God upon the children of disobedience, those that never have trusted Christ and live that ungodly sexual way and in uncleanness, they will one day experience the wrath of God because of their disobedience. And so we are not to be like them at all. We are to be imitators of God, and we are to be totally different. And that's what the bulk of the paragraph is all about. In 8 to 14, it talks about illumination. Paul talks a lot about walking in the light in this passage and in the verses that will be in next week's lesson. But Paul says, walk as children of light. and that the proof that we are walking in the light is also going to be because we manifest the fruit of the Spirit. Now, this list of the fruit of the Spirit is not as exhaustive as Galatians chapter 4, or Galatians 5, but it does talk about the fact that we are to have evidences that our life is different, changed, it's redeemed, and we're to walk in all goodness and in righteousness and in truth. And so those are some of the fruits of the Spirit that will be evident in a truly born-again person, proving what is acceptable unto the Lord. All right? So you'll definitely want to walk through that. But then verses 11 to 14 summarize Paul's encouragement for believers to have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. Okay? Interesting comparison. We're to walk in the fruit of the Spirit. We're not to have anything to do with the fruit of the works of darkness, unfruitful works of darkness. Okay? Our goal is not just to expose and shame those in the darkness, but rather to illuminate their path so they can see that their only hope is to be found in Jesus. Okay? So that's the emphasis of next week's lesson, but it's for us to be walking in Christ's likeness and really be imitators of God. So enjoy your opportunity to teach this lesson. I think you'll really enjoy the lesson that'll follow on November the 10th as well, which expands on this idea of walking in the light. All right, have a great time.